To understand how the Electoral College works, we first need to go back to when the system was created, during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and the compromise they made for how to elect a president. Some were worried about the public choosing a leader, believing everyday citizens were uninformed about political issues. Others wanted to make sure Congress didn't pick the president either, to keep those branches of government separate. So they came up with a system of electors appointed by each state, independent from both people and politicians who cast their votes instead. Each state's share of electors is determined by its number of seats in the House and Senate, and since states' House seats are based off population, so are the electoral votes it gets. That's where slavery played a role when the system was developed. See, the South had a larger population than the North, but a smaller share of voters because slaves couldn't vote. But the South wanted more political power, so they came up with the 3/5 compromise. Slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person in population counts, which gave Southern states more electoral votes. Fast forward now to today, where we still use the Electoral College, of course, to pick a president. There are 538 electors across the country. A candidate has to get at least 270 of them to win the presidency. So, why does our vote matter if electors are the ones picking the president? Well, most states, except for Nebraska and Maine, have laws requiring that all of their electors vote for the candidate who wins the state's popular vote. That means even if a candidate wins a state by just 51%, all that state's electoral votes will go toward that candidate. This kind of winner-take-all method means that the national popular vote can be different from the Electoral College vote, which has happened 5 times through history. Notably in 2016, when Hillary Clinton won almost 3 million more votes than Donald Trump nationally, but lost the Electoral College. And in 2000, when Al Gore won the popular vote but lost the presidency to George W. Bush. Recently, 15 states and the District of Columbia joined the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. They're pledging to give their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the national popular vote, rather than the person who wins the popular vote in their state. But this won't take effect until enough states adopt it, which so far hasn't happened.